All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is TJ Kelly. I will be your moderator for today's discussion. Today's topic of our webinar is high-risk facility logistics addressing benign threat vectors. And joining us to discuss this topic is our panel of experts. First, we have Will Plummer, Chief Security Officer with RaySecur and Director of RaySecur's EODSecur program. Will is a 25-year veteran of the U.S. Army and a master EOD technician. Will, you want to hit the slide there? Thank you. We also have joining us our guest panelist for today, Mr. Chuck Randolph. Chuck is Senior Director of Operations and Intelligence for At-Risk International. Chuck is also a 30-year Army veteran and president of the International Protective Security Board, who has a trade show coming up next week. Is that right, Chuck?
Yep.
Very good. So before we dive in, just a quick introduction. If you're not familiar with RaySecur, we are the world leader in mail security, headquartered in Boston, Mass. Experts in mail threat detection and real-time analysis and support. And Chuck is here representing At-Risk International, leaders in global protection for people, property, and information. So gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today. Our agenda, we will cover the state of mail security. Will's going to take us through the statistics and numbers for mail threats and events that occurred in this year in 2021. And then there will be a back and forth discussion on analysis of risks and in areas usually considered benign. We will save time at the end for question and answer. So if anyone has any questions or points of discussion you would like to hear Will and Chuck go over, please feel free to throw those into the Q&A form right here in Zoom, and we will get to those at the end. So without further ado, let's bring in Will Plummer to take us through the driving factors for mail security threats. And take it away, Will.
Thank you, DJ. Chuck, thanks for joining us, man. We appreciate it.
Of course.
It's always fun. All right, so we're going to go through some stats, because we got to know what's happening and kind of what's driven us into some things that we've been forced to do. 2021 was a really interesting year. We climbed out of COVID. We will talk about COVID, unfortunately, a little bit more than we want to in here. But the main themes for what drove people to do things fall primarily in these four areas. We've all seen the media mistrust and mistrust of the government. That's continual, and you'll see that with the stats, what showed up with the government. And we will discuss COVID, like I said, unfortunately, quite a bit. And a big part, and we'll dedicate a good chunk of this, is mandatory vaccine policies, because that's going to affect a lot of corporations, a lot of companies. And with that, there's going to be some fallout. And then when it comes to some of the personal feelings and personal events that people did, a feel of lack of representation. There's a big paradigm shift, and people are responding to it. And unfortunately, they're using mail to do that in a lot of means. So 2021's growing problem areas, things that we saw. Corporate events were targeted quite a bit. A huge jump in the government, and we'll discuss that when the numbers come out a little bit, but those are two big ones to pay attention to. Trigger topics, COVID, again, like I said, we're going to mention that. The big one on that is firing and laying off of individuals, whether it's tied to company downsizing or tied to mandatory COVID vaccinations. So that is something that is going to have an effect on us, and is having an effect right now, but we're seeing that transition into 2022 as well. Emergent threats, white powder toxicity jumped up this year. So last year and previous years, when a white powder threat showed up, it was most of the time it was benign. What we're seeing now is an increase in caustic soda, powdered bleach, or things where there's intended to cause some harm to the individual that's exposed. And with that, it just shows an increase in aggression. And that's, unfortunately, it's on the rise. And then the other thing that jumped really strangely this year was death threats and hate crime. And we'll hit those a little bit, but people who feeling, without some form of back trust or misaligned, it's one of the ways they reach out. And unfortunately, if you look at the escalation process, mail is often a step in that. And it's something to pay close attention to. An assessment for 2022, we are going to see white powder threats continue to increase. It's just a cheap way to get a company to have a reaction. We've all saw what happened at January 6th, and we'll look at the year stats a little bit, but midterm election response is going to be something we're all going to have to deal with. And then high profile targeting. People are no longer working the corporate headquarters that are very important. Now they're working out of their homes, and they're even easier to target them. So 2021 containers stayed fairly steady. We saw an increase in letter threats by a little bit, but it wasn't a specific number. And that's primarily tied to death threats and racial threats. Substance, this is what was actually reported and what was caused a response by the first responders. Like I mentioned, increase in written threats that came out. The ones that jumped a little bit that are a little surprising is threat letters, like I mentioned. Drugs went up by about 9%, and that's drugs that was found, recovered, and a lot of that was found in the workplace. That's been a recent problem that companies have to figure out how they're going to have a stance on this type of stuff. It's not just one a year now, it's 5 or 6 a year. And what are you going to do about it? White powder threats stayed significant. The number that jumped here that was surprising to me is the amount of IEDs that were run that people ended the incident thinking an IED. Now that's a lot of hoaxes, but it was 1.7% in last year and it's 2.5% now. Now that carries when you look at who was targeted. Government shot up exponentially. Response to January 6th, the mandatory COVID response by the government, mandatory vaccines, people were targeted. Now that doesn't just mean that was in DC in the Beltway. This is representatives that represent yourself and their voting constituents. If you look at the government alone with white powder threats, we had Dr. Fauci got hit earlier this year. His quote was, if I open up, I had white powder on my face. If it's anthrax, I take 30 days of Cipro, I'm okay. If it's ricin, I'm dead. Then you had the Republican Party for Arizona because they are contending the election. Senator Rand Paul was right after that. 3 weeks ago was Representative Omar. These events happen, and they're happening amongst the local populace, and that's because that's where the government officials are.
Hey, Will, do you know if this includes educators as well, or would that be a separate slice?
That does include educators.
Okay, interesting.
So that number it went up a lot, and we'll look at it in a second. But yeah, it includes educators. Business stayed about where it was at last year, but the residents numbers jumped by like 14%. That's primarily because people aren't working in the office space anymore. They've moved to the house. That doesn't mean they're not targeting the business. That just means they're targeting where the people are located at physically.
Now, it also include drugs, right, Will?
Yes, it includes drugs as well. So the people that responded, remember when I mentioned that 2-point-some% for IEDs? The bomb squad number jumped up because people are leaving an incident site. We're leaving for an incident site thinking, I have an IED. They're finishing it at 2-point-some% thinking that's what they have. But most of the time when bomb squad gets called in, somebody else steps up and takes over. What you see significant in this one is the amount of FBI responses that happen. A lot of these threats are federal, and a lot of them are being responded to federally. So charges and when things wouldn't necessarily be escalated or haven't been in the past, they're beginning to be treated with the federal response.
Can I add one here also, Will? And I'm sorry to interrupt you. You've got USPIS down the bottom there, 9.3%. I know when you and your team do a lot of the research looking at these numbers, the USPIS is mandated for mail security reporting in a broader way than ever sort of other agencies do their reporting. But if they still only represent less than 10%, does that, what does that mean to you? Are we potentially missing some of the numbers here? Maybe it's worse than we think it is, kind of thing, because they're only such a small slice. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we are missing numbers. There wasn't a USPIS report obviously generated yet. This is what happened this year. They'll do an annual at the end, but a lot of this is who was ultimately responsible. So if it's not a USPS document or not a USPS package, they don't necessarily have purview over it. It's going to be the local police. So, and there is only so many of them when you look at a countrywide response requirement. Mm-hmm. So if you look at 2021, there's a couple things that happened. We all saw the news. January 6th, there was the event that happened in DC, and there was a spike after that at federal judges, lawyers who represented both sides. And that spike goes for a certain period of time, and then it happens to fall off. Then you have the trial of George Floyd. That happened. Government and business were targeted. Businesses that fell one side or the other based on their political beliefs or what they stand for, they were targeted. If you work your way through, then you have the summer protests that we all watched happen. Mm-hmm. Numbers jump. Some of the spikes in here, excuse me, for example, the one through the January 6th, that was 16 threat letters that were dropped to churches throughout the South. That's why that number jumped up. There are individuals that stand out, but the peaks and valleys tend to fall in line with something that happens with the U.S. in mass. As you work your way across, the one thing that we're sitting in right now is corporate vaccination mandates. And we have a section we'll talk about on that, but we're in the middle of it. Companies are mandating that you are going to do this or you're not going to work for us anymore. And with that, people are responding. Chuck?
Well, quick question. You have some anomalies in here and you kind of talked a little bit about them. Any other observations that you have on some of these like spiked anomalies that people are probably wondering as they look at this slide?
So usually those are individuals or
Mhm.
like the one in May. That was going after a particular minority museum. It was
Mhm.
targeted by a large group of folks, but it was going at one place. So mail reporting is often spotty because we are forced to do open source with much of this. And with that, you end up catching the mainline events, and those are the ones that get high profile.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially if you think about, sometimes as analysts, if there might be some protective intel folks listening. And if you look at events in reverse and say, what can we take from that? Is it true anomaly? Is it some skew in the data, or is there something around that we need to go back or reverse engineer so we can understand what triggers and indicators might be there that then we can inform places like the mailroom or other security folks. But appreciate that additional. I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, you're good. We're there. So we're going to roll this into what we're kind of here for. So we've taken the numbers, we framed it. We're here to talk about benign vectors and things that we do daily that we don't necessarily identify as a threat readily. One of the first problems that we see is like mail is a daily process. You talk to people, they just go, yeah, it happens. A lot of people will say they don't have a mail threat. And then you talk to them for a little while and they'll say, hey, I did have that event, and then 3 months ago this event, and then 9 months ago this event. And you look at them and you go, you have a problem. There's something that's going on.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I think, when we look at the data that you just provided, that's one thing I love about you guys in the team over there, or now that I'm in Texas, all y'all put together at RaySecur, is kind of the data and information that says, look, here's kind of some of the events that are happening. Because when you look at those, you think, wow, I did not realize that, or I didn't understand that, when you look at it, you're like, well, no kidding, that would trigger more events. But, we have, as you call them here, easily hidden things or donut making events that happen every day that different teams do because it's part of their standard process. But we're not able to connect the dots because, we're looking for risk to show up at our front door and go, hey, I'm risk, I'm here. Can we do battle? When in fact, risk probably is manifesting itself in the most quiet areas of an organization or a program. And, now is the perfect time to kind of look at those. I mean, I think, I think we'll talk about it later, but, you mentioned it earlier, endpoints are different. They're at home. They're not in corporate America. So there's a lot of small, somebody once said, don't sweat the small stuff. I would say we're in a time now where sweating the small stuff is probably super important.
Right. Yeah. The other side of this that it's an increased anonymity in the workplace. So people are honestly more transient within their own organization. So you have varied days that people call their normal day in, and the security folks, unfortunately, have got to learn that pattern as well. So it's a common desk space now and not a dedicated one for somebody.
Yeah, and that's the key. I mean, I think you said it, pattern recognition, and then anomalies in the pattern that say, hey, what's happening over there that we need to look at. But if we don't have these conversations and connect dots through hub activity or other, I guess the cool word now is convergence activities, and we as risk professionals aren't having those conversations, then we don't know if we can't create that common operating information.
Yeah, it's harder. It's getting harder on everybody. You'll see that leaves gaps. Gaps will end up causing threats to come on in.
Yeah, I think the interesting point there is like you have this like, is it harder or more complex?
Right.
And I believe it. Maybe it's one of the same, maybe it's not, but sometimes we get to the point to where we have so much information. I think Dick Lake, retired 2-star Marine Corps Intel lead, once said, data is an analyst's problem. And it's true because there's so much coming in nowadays. Like, okay, everything's a fire. I don't know which one is the fire. So it's interesting.
It is. And that's a very good point, Chuck. The data is an analyst problem. However, analysts don't necessarily work in the real world. So you've got to take that data and be able to codify it in something where somebody who can't affect change actually can affect change.
Yeah. But people say like, but Will, Chuck, TJ, like, what analysts, what do they need to know about mail security? I mean, they need to know all the things because they're about pattern recognition. And, whether it's cyber or whether it's physical, it's understanding what are the patterns and what are the key triggers and indicators and requirements that I need to know so that I can look out to say, come over and with my cup of coffee and say, hey, Will, we've got protest activity. Last time that happened, we had more threats to the CEO. I'm going to go drink my coffee. And now, somebody can go, let's go ahead and pull out those protocols and see where we are with them.
Chuck, I was having a conversation with an analyst at a large bank in the Midwest that I will leave nameless here. And to his credit, he downloaded a bunch of reports from our site and was very interested in what we had to say about mail security. But when I was, discussing with him where we might take that, hey, who's responsible for implementing this on your team? It basically was, well, I'm just the analyst. I'm just here to learn about it. And immediately was this brick wall, right? So, I wonder if that problem is prevalent everywhere. And, you guys are closer to it than I am, but even just last month had that conversation,
Well, I think, Will kind of brings it up at the first bullet point here. We have daily processes. We have, if you're older, you might remember the commercial for Dunkin' Donuts, where the guy's like, time to make the donuts. And you have organizations, I'm not saying they're good or bad, just over time, their process becomes that donut making. And really, it's like taking that moment, and COVID's a perfect, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit. COVID's a perfect overlay to say, hey, what are we doing in this moment? Why are we doing this? Who needs to know? How do we connect? But anyway, so that's a great point. And analysts are at the center of that. In any intelligence, what do they say? Intelligence fed, operations led mantra.
So let me hop in, Will, before you take the next one. Just want to remind everyone that we do have our questions open. If you have any points you want to hear the guys discuss, or we want to go over any of the statistics that Will introduced up the top, please feel free to jump into the Q&A box, and we will get to those at the end.
All right, so why threats get ignored? I mentioned this in the last slide a little bit, but they're seen as benign. And we use that name intentionally, we use that nomenclature intentionally because they're not benign. They are a problem. But people can just misidentify the possibility of threats. Oftentimes, costs are dismissible. If you go, no, it's just a mailroom. I can suck that cost up if need be. I can eat that, but not necessarily understanding the backside to what that cost might be. 3 days out of your facility for a decontamination event is a significant cost, and it's going to continue. Oftentimes, and we'll talk about this a little later, some of the solutions to fix these are fairly inexpensive, and it's something that you can do readily with what you already have available. But again, I think about how the last slide and this slide kind of are interconnected. And you think this idea of like, it's benign. Will, it's a low risk thing. I personally, this is not representative of the U.S. government or any organizations I work for. I hate the term low risk. It's unknown. But I understand, especially sometimes we need to put a percentage on things. And then is it green, yellow, red? It makes it easier to talk to leadership about resourcing, and that's great. But I think these benign things often get mislabeled as low risk when in fact it's unknown. Correct.
And the only way to know it is to create common operating information. And, TJ, if you're German and Will, you're French and I'm from Latin America. We all think in different languages. We all dream in different languages. When we're thinking about risk management and problem solving, we're going through these in different ways. Whereas if we can create common operating information amongst all three of us, we have data. By the way, we have data with a hypothesis because that's very important. And we're looking at this data from the same way. And from this common operating information, we can now have risk discussions in which I say, hey, well, I got a box. It's no big deal. What happens every once in a while. And TJ goes, wait a minute. What do you mean it happens every other, So we can now have these little benign activities that we can go across the board and have discussions. And again, I think, Will, you've talked about it many times, and discussions are cheap. They're inexpensive force multipliers, if you'll allow me, between organizations, the departments that says, hey, we don't go over and talk to that tribe, or we don't go over and talk to this group. Why not? At the end of the day, we're all part of an organization or part of a greater good that we're trying to perform safety and keep things going. So I love this slide in particular.
I think there's another point in this that a lot of corporations have to deal with: the fact that you have multiple, companies that work inside that organization trying to provide somewhat similar tasks.
Yeah.
So you have company A who hires a very small company B to do task whatever it is, and that whole task must be managed by facilities, who is company C, and those stovepipes become problematic because what's in my contract might cross over with somebody else's contract.
And you get into that. I understand, the service, the SLA, and you get into that contract management as also an anchor in that prevents risk. It prevents people from, see something, say something. It's that easy. But I'm a contractor. I come in, I do my job. I work for another contractor. And at the end of the day, if I go, hey, I saw that's not part of the SLA, do your job, move forward. So it's about empowering at the highest level also that, like, look, if you have an anomaly, let's call it and let's identify it collectively. Sounds easy, hard to do.
Yeah, lawyers get involved. All right, so how might threats arrive? There's a couple things here that we'll talk about on the next few slides, but the big one for this is targeting of high-profile individuals. So we are used to the corporate headquarters being the castle. We're used to, we bring everybody inside, we're behind our own firewalls, we have control over everybody and everything. The EP teams get to slow down a little bit because everybody's inside of a perceived safe environment.
Yep.
Well, COVID hit, folks are working from home, and that includes the CEOs and the C-suite. And that target is now in one of 4 or 5 homes they might own. And targeting them is now easier.
True. And if you think about this, based on the last slide too, we now have organizations within organizations.
Right.
And some folks may not know or may not understand that a CEO at work may not be protected by the same vehicle, if you will, as at home, and vice versa. There are residential teams and there's corporate teams. There might be different ways that that's all done. And there's, again, gaps exist, not because people purposely put them there, but because of protocols and processes and lack of common operating information, gaps start to appear. And we know now we live in the information age, and, it's a pretty easy search to see sometimes, like, where does the CEO live, or where does the head of HR live, or, where does Will Plummer live? Hit me on the side and I'll give you his address. But, and then we have different endpoints. So if you think about what we're talking about, we're talking mail security here, but these are themes that cross the organization, cyber or physical. We now have CEOs working from home. Their supply chain goes through their house or to their house directly. Maybe they receive a box or a package, or an individual knocks on their door, or somebody, gets into their network through, because, maybe one of the staff or somebody has their kid on a Zoom call, much like we are for school or something. But, it's really about slowing down and looking at our risk map at scale and looking at all these different points and saying, what are we doing here? Are we good? Will, you and I are both in the Army. There was this thing where you look at a risk and say, we're going to circle X that, which means for the folks in the audience, that means we're going to accept that risk.
Right.
But I think it's about identifying those risks and saying, here's the list. Here's the things that we're going to accept. Here's the things that are unacceptable that we have to have a protocol around.
So I think it's interesting. So when everybody started COVID, we all kind of had the same problem, especially with the EP side of the house. Like, all right, so you used to all go to the corporate headquarters. Now it's going to the house. How do we fix that process? And that process, I think, for most corporations and companies is solidified. They know what they're going to do. They've figured it out. What's the next one going to be when people don't come back, or when you now need to stand up off sites within neighborhoods, or how to handle the next iteration of what we're about to go through again? I think, honestly.
Well, was talking last week on the podcast about COVID and. Somebody, are we through COVID? And actually, we're probably not. We're probably just getting ready for phase 2, possibly phase 3. And at what point does the pandemic become an endemic? I mean, you have this idea of priorities and requirements. Priorities, what we have to do right now. Requirements, what we must do all the time. And at what point does the pandemic become another endemic requirement that we have to deal with? You look at security teams, a lot of them are like, oh gosh, we're gonna reduce. When in fact, if you look at all the vectors and you look at these combined and converged events that we have to deal with, in fact, it might require that we have more people. Some people just spit out their coffee and are like, I have to make a resource ask. But I think everything that you kind of referenced up to now, Will, kind of talks about having that quiet look, or, taking that piece of paper and your cup of coffee and saying, okay, where are we? And what does the future look like? Because what got us here definitely may not get us through the next thing.
Yeah, and with that assessment, that cup of coffee needs to sit somewhere other than in an echo chamber.
Yeah, absolutely.
Come take a look and honestly look at it and go, all right, let's red hat this. And It might be ugly and it might look like expensive, but it needs to be done.
Hey, yeah, everybody told the emperor his clothes were great, and that didn't work out so well.
True. All right, so how can we harden our environment? How do we fix what's going on? The honest answer for this is to start with an assessment, like we just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be costly. Most of the solutions, if you put a good, intelligent human being in place and you let them go with change detection and figure out common sense and empower them, you'll end up with a good answer. And it's not going to cost you everything that you have to give, if that makes sense. No, Chuck, we talked about this a little bit ago. I mean, this is a legitimate, I wish more people would look at it this way.
It is. I mean, I've been around corporate America and now on the consulting side and trying to help folks solve problems and look at strategies. And often, and I understand why, like, hey, can we go buy something right now that will fix the problem? Right. And sometimes, yes, but sometimes it does just take an assessment. Like, again, we've been talking about, what are we doing? What have we done so far? What do we need to do? Who have we brought to the table? I mean, Will, you mentioned just a couple seconds ago, red teaming, and most people are like, red teaming, does that mean like break into the building and tell everyone where your gaps are? Or does that mean a penetration test on a network? Yeah, but it also means looking at things from the lens of the aggressor or the lens of the enemy, if you will, or the risk, and saying, if I was risk, what would I look at? That involves, if you're fortunate enough to have an intelligence team, in your organization, ask their help. They're good at this and they'll love it because they can put a spreadsheet together. And we all know Intel folks love a spreadsheet. But when you look at that and you sit down with those folks, now we can start developing requirements as well. As we look at the stuff, we look at an assessment, we can give requirements to folks in terms of, we need new SLAs, we need memorandum of understanding. Intel team, I need you to start looking at these requirements so we can start making some forecasting. I hate the word predictability in Intel, but we can forecast some stuff. So, and again, this is all cheap. I'm sorry, this is all inexpensive and not resource intensive. But from Will, TJ, and Chuck sitting down saying, okay, where do we think our gaps are? Have we looked at our executives? What are the issues in our supply chain? Has anybody spoken binary to the cyber folks? Okay, now we can look at them and say, is there anything that we can do or purchase or add on that will streamline this? Again, Will, you and I are both military. We've spent some time in places that probably not a place you'd want to take your spouse and your kids for vacation. And oftentimes you go into these, we'll call them command headquarters. Right. And you would see a lot of different platforms that were slapped together because it was, hey, let's buy the next best thing. Let's do the next thing that the next thing that we think is the right thing to help us track and mitigate our risk. But at the end of the day, then at some point you walk in and you say, great. And you look at the administrator or the Intel analyst or somebody there and you're like, hey, what does this do? And they go, I don't know.
Or they don't know how to use it.
Right. And at the end, and I would suggest that the easiest way is probably the way you should start, because at the end of the day, we must remember that while we have all these bureaucracy and things that are on top of us, we're all in it for one thing. We're all in it for several things: protect people, places, and organizations.
So one of the things that I look at when I do an assessment is like, what's the lowest common denominator? A lot of times it comes down to the human being. I mean, you have people that are in high turnover, generally entry-level positions, and you're asking them to be a key indicator in your matrix of whether we are safe or not safe. And that can be problematic.
And the other thing too is like, sometimes it's the hubris of our own industry. Like, hey, we're the security people, we're the SMEs. But sometimes the most amazing ideas might come from somebody who's like, hey, Will, I've been working this mailroom for 15 years. If we could do X, or we could do Y, or hey, Chuck, I've been driving the boss for 5 years and this is what I've seen. Or simply asking somebody at reception, how do you think this is working? What would you do? You might find some very interesting. Thoughts that you could put to paper and use.
Yeah, that's true. I had a few times in my career when I was about to do something really dumb, and one of the people that worked for me stepped up and went, "Hey, probably not a good idea. You might want to that one through."
Thank goodness for those people too.
Thank God, yeah, they step up and help out. So one of the things we keep talking about, this is the one that currently is causing people to have frustration. I don't know what your organization does, but with COVID mandatory vaccinations, but it's about to be the problem that we're all going to have to deal with for the next who knows how long. We've talked to several companies, and I know Chuck's got the same thing going on, where their company is mandating vaccinations and say, we're going to do this by this date. If you don't, by the next date, you no longer work for us. Well, let's put this into context, right? All these people have been working remote. You've given them computers, you have given them phones, you have sent them home, and now you're going to fire them. And you tell them, pack that all up and bring it back. What's about to walk into your headquarters, or what's about to walk into your facility from people that you just laid off? And if you got to assume one's going to be a problem, you need to assume almost all of them are going to be a problem. That's a really hard problem to sort.
Well, we go back to this idea, that I mentioned earlier, which is you have intelligence-driven, operations-led. But I would suggest humbly that now in the new environment, the pandemic that at some point will become an endemic, we have an intelligence-driven, operations-led, threat-informed. Because there's threat managers in your organization. One merely has to go over to ATAP and see what's happening with that organization, or others, and say, look, what's the threat layer on this? Earlier, Will, in one of the other slides, you said something, at least it was listed about insider threat. We know many of the what's called pathway to violence, some is also a pathway to insider threat.
Right. And
if we all, again, can get in the room and start talking and say, hey, look, we have this issue. It's not going away. And like you, we've been dealing with a lot of organizations that are saying, hey, we're about to issue out a mandate about vaccines. We need to understand what that means for us, what the threat picture means for us, how it changes. Where do you think the gaps are? What do we need to do to mitigate the gaps? And now we're going to send boxes to all our employees and tell them to send back your stuff. Time out. Have we thought about the unintended consequences of that? And I think that's where the security professional comes in, and that it's almost that red teaming again, gang. If you think about it, like, wait a minute, what does that mean? Second, third orders of effect, unintended consequences of what we're going to do. Yes, we need to get the equipment back. Is that the best way to do it? All that's coming back to the office. Should we have an offsite, a secondary site to do it? All these options that we can develop by merely asking the question, what could happen from this?
I think another thing that, and you brought it back up, and it was listed, and I probably should have said something more about it. The insider threat is bigger than it's ever been, at least for most of the people that we work with.
Yeah.
It's a problem. And there's some fundamental reasons why it's problematic. One, Google doesn't let you misspell names anymore. It really autocorrects things for you. Things don't necessarily look like we've all been trained to look for. If you go look at the USPS poster for what a suspect package is, I've run hundreds of suspect packages, and not talking Middle East, we're talking in the States. And yes, they can look like that, but oftentimes recently they look normal because people aren't necessarily having to do stuff in their garage anymore. The threats are not misspelled. They are printed out. Everything matches, and people know what the inside of the organization looks like. They know who the HR lead is. They know who they're targeting because they are an insider threat.
Yeah.
The other thing that comes up with that makes it mainstay is with the intelligence aspect we talked about, that list of necessarily who you know has aggressions towards your organization might also have a secondary list of groups that might be within that you might want to pay attention to. Not saying you can do anything with that. I mean, you have your own legal things to worry about, but that's something to pay attention to.
Yeah, and I don't think you're saying, hey, look, run your own source network for all of our .gov folks. You're simply saying, look, open source is truly like growing exponentially, even over the last 5 years. And you're right. I mean, you can go to what's it called, Grammarly, type in like, hey, I'm going to write a threat letter to TJ, and I'm writing it in a different language. But I know if I go to Grammarly, I'm at least going to get at something that's going to look more correct, and maybe it's going to get through some filters. People are getting, let's not even bring up drones and all these other hybrid activities that are starting to happen. I think the word asymmetric was used a long time ago, and I think it's slowly bleeding over into the corporate world now. And again, what's required is we have to look at threats at scale as leaders and say, look, I need a way in which I can track threats. I need a way in which I can go back and say, tell me, you have to have a good, we were talking earlier, like to spend money. Well, having a system by which you can track and manage threats is probably very important, because you want to be able to pull metrics and say, wait a minute, you mentioned, Will, that we had a white powder incident last year. How many have we had?
Right.
Let's walk through that. I have a question. Let's find out. Let's have a hypothesis and go get data around it. And then we can make a risk statement. So, and I would say the vaccine mandate. I mean, look, we're seeing countries talking about a vaccine mandate. Let's just pause there for one split second. A country is now going to mandate that everyone's going to be vaccinated, or likely they're going to mandate. Whew. What is the unintended consequences of that?
Oh, yeah.
Is it civil war?
Huge.
Yeah. Is it civil war? Likely not, but is it something at a magnitude that suddenly, wait a minute, we've got manufacturing belts just outside the capital city. Should we consider that? I mean, it's all the things are at play. I mean, COVID is now affecting grant strategy, which is affecting geopolitics, which is affecting corporate politics, which all the way down the line is going to affect the individual worker. And it just makes it that much more complex for we as security leaders to manage the threat around.
I think it's interesting if you look at the security aspect of this. The lawyer says, yes, this is legal. We can do this. Great. The CEO says, I believe that this is what we should be doing. Great. Those other tasks that got to be completed in that decision-making process, it seems to me, are somewhat just not being done. And that's a security leader's requirement, is to step in and kind of think some of those things through. What's the second order effects for what we're about to do?
I see, and you've seen a few organizations discussing it, this idea of a chief risk officer that comes on board that says, look, we're going to look at risk at scale. Right. And from that, we'll have these pipelines, and then in the pipelines, lines of effort that drive risk-making decisions throughout the organization. So this is definitely, and I would imagine most people that are on this webinar are probably already savvy enough to know, or leaning forward to say, hey, we're doing something where we have to. But I would say if you have colleagues in the industry that are struggling with this, help throw that yellow card down and say, this is a thing that we need to continue to look at.
Absolutely. So what can we do? One of the things that I say, one of my mantras is always make sure whatever you choose is relevant, reliable, reasonable, repeatable. If any one of those are out of whack, it's going to stop. You're going to end up with people who are like, I just can't, the amount of effort to repeat this training event is too much. I can't do it. So it's how I use to keep things, in line when I come up with an idea, because I'm known to find really weird ideas if I don't. The big thing that we talk about all the time is leaning on people. Focus on people first. Whatever solutions you choose to put in place, if you have empowered the individual that's going to be part of that process ahead of time, and you have trained them and you put energy into them and they know they're part of the solution, you'll end up with a much better end state, something that you can work with. And there is when, after you've done the risk assessment and you walked your way through all of it, that's where you make your money. And it doesn't have to cost the bank. It doesn't have to be that bad.
Yep. I like to look at things, and I wish I would have thought of this a long time ago, but really it was an old skip level boss I had who said, look, it's people, partnerships, priority, and protect. Understand each of those quadrants and what's in there and make it simple. And I think the most important thing of that, to emphasize and underscore what you're saying, is a team concept. It's people. People are going to see something early. People are going to have ideas. People are going to make mistakes, and people are also going to be the aggressors. But, it's understanding that we still are in a people-driven organization, whether on the physical or digital side, at some point, there's a person in that equation.
Absolutely.
And we have to, we've kind of beat the dead horse on this, but we must share information. We must create common operating information, or you'll wake up one day and find that you're kind of behind the curve, and you're rushing to try to spend resources and get ahead of a wave that may just overtake you or your organization.
Absolutely. And we see this time and time again, but you all see very successful companies that do it right. All right. Questions? I think we're about right on time. DJ?
Yeah. So thank you, everybody, for submitting questions so far. And if there are others, please, again, feel free to throw them into the Q&A box. We will add those to our list here. But one of the things I wanted to just go back and circle back on is, Will, a few slides ago, you had mentioned, you had a line in there that said innocent actors. And I think this is, when folks are, in residential, if the bosses are working from home or something like that. But could you just elaborate on how innocent actors kind of fit into, the whole piece here? Is this a matter of somebody delivers a piece of mail they didn't realize was, contaminated or dangerous in some way, and now they're just bringing it upstairs because that's what they think they're supposed to do? Because that to me seems like a pretty significant security gap. If somebody doesn't know that they are somehow participating in a threat, right? How would something like that kind of fit in all this?
And I think Chuck will have a good one to throw in on this one too. So I'm smiling a little bit. Yeah. So there are a lot of really ingenious ways to get something inside of an organization, and then doing something with Mule, or whatever term you want to use, is one way of doing it. And yeah, exactly like you mentioned, mailing something to somebody that's going to get through. If you can get it in the hands of the assistant to somebody that you're trying to get after, there is already an assumed safety factor there, and that's another problem in and of itself. So that means you probably need to train some of those folks on what to look for that would be the targets for that.
Look, Will, I think you're right on that. Look, a lot of organizations, at some point in the organizations, they're service-oriented people. I'm here, to serve, which is, it's a great human value. I want to serve my fellow man or my fellow person. But we know that threat actors can then use that. Sometimes, it's called phishing. I need Will to press a button, or I need TJ to deliver a package, or I need Chuck to just forward my phone. But, back in the early days when I first started out as an investigator, we called it pretexting. Now they call it phishing and social engineering. But, it's easy. I don't want to say easy, but it can be easy to manipulate somebody who's already has a mindset of customer service.
Right.
And then we, as security professionals, we wake up and we're looking every way, and we're grouchy. Just look at Will and I. We just wake up grouchy. I don't know what's the matter with you, TJ. I need to drink the same coffee you do. But we also have an obligation to help folks realize, like, hey, look, you could be an unintended, vehicle by which somebody wants to target someone. So here's some things you can look for. And by the way, if you have a question, I'm available to you. And I think that's an important thing we can do to empower those folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a question here about schools specifically. You had mentioned at the top of the presentation talking about education gets wrapped up into the government statistics. Will, I remember a few months back you talking about how New York City had multiple, I think it was white powders incidents to their schools, all in the same week or two, or I forget the details exactly. But the education sector seems to be showing up more and more, lately. So this specific question is about how do we expect schools to augment their current mail or item screening efforts? And so I know that when I've spoken to higher ed specifically, they're often looking for narcotics, but also just general threats. I assume would be wrapped up to that in general. So what could either of you speak to in terms of education and kind of that whole sector?
So there's actually a profession, and a good example is NACMS, the North American Collegiate Mail Handler Association. There are people who work inside those organizations whose task and purpose is to provide mail and mail security, mail screening. Unfortunately, they're often underfunded. Now, the New York example, and that's one of many throughout the year, white powder threats and mailed threats inside of schools are becoming the new fire alarm and the new, honestly, the new bomb scare. The reason is a lot of times there's no law locally around it that's going to make somebody pay for their actions. If I pull a fire alarm, my mom and dad are to get a huge fine for bringing the fire truck, and they're going to pay for the fuel and pay for everything else. If I send in a bomb threat, I'm going to be charged, possibly federally. But if I send in a mailed threat, first off, you have to assume it's an escalation. With the active school shooting problems we've been having, you have to assume that there is going to be another step and you must act on it. And with that, it's probably a good sieve that you could put in place to look for those events before they come up. We look at social media on the event that you mentioned. There was comments that were made. They were made the week before on social media. I mean, there's
Exactly.
a lot of data out there that you could use. And this is another medium that you could use to increase your defenses, harden yourself, harden your organization.
Yeah, exactly. I think and by the way, Jim or James, thanks for that question. It's an important one, I think, because look, our kids go to school and we never thought like, hey, I'm the PTA president. I never thought that I'd start getting threats either physically or through email that threaten me or my extended family simply because a child's father or mother or brother or cousin or somebody doesn't agree with the position maybe the school district's taken on COVID or they're seen as right or left leaning, and that's not what I want. I mean, we think of, we often, Will and I are in the same panels and we're in the same, we in the same Starbucks talking about executives. But executive and luminaries scale. And now you have these folks, in the PTA or in the school board that are receiving these threats. Will, you bring a good point. What are we, I know there are several school districts out there that are doing monitoring efforts around their schools so they can kind of identify. But I'd like to underscore if you're out there and you're dealing with schools, help them understand that now they need to look at things and they need to look at their requirements slightly different. Because you bring up a good point. We're used to looking at bomb threats because little Johnny doesn't want to take his math test today, or little Janie's mad because somebody shunned her in school, and there's greater things we need to look at, and we need to pivot our requirements to assess those threat vectors too.
Absolutely, and unfortunately, it's going to continue. These things don't just stop.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is.
So let me ask a question here about communicating from the security team to, or maybe just corporate in general. Should organizations be communicating to their employees, to their members, right? We talk about insider threats. Should these organizations be communicating to the members? These are our security procedures and protocols. This is what we're watching for. So if you try to pull anything like this, we're going to know about it. And here's why. Is this a risk mitigation strategy to kind of avoid it in the first place, because you're dissuading people from doing anything by telling them they'll get caught or you're going to find it, that kind of thing. How transparent to non-security members should the organizations be kind of from the top down, right? How much do we want to talk about that?
Chuck, go ahead, brother.
So I think it was an interesting point. That's a great question, TJ. If that was from you or from somebody in the audience, thank you. That's very interesting. So a lot of folks in security, you talk about, where did you come from? Did you come from a .mil? Did you come from a .le? Did you come from a .gov? Or did you come from a .com? And if you think about that, like if I'm from maybe a .le, I want to wait so I can make an arrest. If I come from a .gov, like maybe a 3-letter agency, I want to wait because I want to see where this goes and see what the larger thing is. Coming from a .mil, I want to smash it and be done with it, move on to the next thing. And then if you come from a .com, I just don't want to deal with it. But when you think about all that, that kind of informs the way some organizations, I think, look at the way they do it. Me personally, I'm like, let people know, hey, look, for the betterment of the organization, we're looking. I don't know that we need to tell everyone our tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, if you will. But I think in my mind, it's okay to say, hey, look, loose lips sink ships. We're here for the organization. We're here for your safety. We're here to make sure that the boat runs smoothly. And, if you see something weird, let us know. We'll check it out. We're not being big brother. We're just safeguarding our employees, which is our number one asset. I don't know. What about you? What say you, Mr. Plummer?
No, I agree. The one thing that I would say is deterrence is also a factor. And if they know it's going to be a one thing that they've got to go through, somebody might not have the motivation to do it.
Yeah.
Low hanging fruit, you might be able to knock down with deterrence alone. Over motivated ones, you're still going to have to deal with them.
Yeah. And I think, TJ, to that too, I mean, there's telling folks, and then there's programs by which we're monitoring and looking at the keys of the kingdom, or making sure that we're monitoring the luminaries or the important points and endpoints in our company as well.
And it sounds like there's some messaging at play there, right? Just because you have to say something doesn't mean you want to be careful about how that gets messaged. Yeah.
Talk to your marketing folks, talk to your communication folks. Those marcoms will help you develop a message. I mean, they might get scared about it, but if you tell them, like, look, we're just trying to let everybody know what we do. We're being open about the fact that we're putting the priority and safety of our employees first.
Mm-hmm. I want to circle back to earlier bullet that said costs are easily dismissed, or I forget exactly the wording, but the cost of implementing some of these security procedures will I think you said if it's considered a low priority, it's easy to kind of push that aside and say whatever, it's just a mail room. And Chuck, when we were talking earlier, you had given an example of a company that you mentioned maybe you want to put a checkpoint in before loading dock or something along those lines, and I think you were met with, well, that sounds like a lot of time and money. And so it seems like there's maybe some misweighting of, what else costs time and money is, a serious incident here. Maybe we're not weighting those costs accurately, right? What can we say about how you might want to kind of compare those two things?
I think it's interesting because as security people, I mean, we have a language all of our own. We're okay with things like threats and, hey, by the way, Will got a death threat. Okay, well, we're going to mitigate it and do whatever. That's like commonplace to us.
Right.
My wife is also in corporate security, and oftentimes around our dinner table, we have things and we have to remember, like, wait a minute, our kids are listening to this. But I think what we need to do, though, is we need to understand and talk in the language of business, and but we also need to make sure that we underscore, like, at the end of the day, this is a life safety event. Here's the business case around it. Here's what we need to do. Here's what happens if this risk statement happens, and let's play that out. And let's talk about scenarios. And let's talk about managing or making scenarios, or talking to the business continuity folks and finding champions in our organization that go, hey, these folks are far more than just guns, gates, and guards.
The big thing about that I find is it's probably education. It's empowering. The management needs to get involved. People, decision makers, need to get involved. But to do that, you have to educate them. I mean, there's the military thing that Chuck brought up. There's something to be said about letting a 2-star general walk around without a plan and a list in his back pocket. If you let him wander, they're probably not going to find what you want to show them. They're going to find the things you really don't want them to identify. If you come up with a plan and you educate and you show them the problem set and you lay out what you want, you're not going to have so much wasted time. They just need to be informed of what the threats are, and then let them circle exit if need be, but do it honest, straightforward, not trying to scare people, information brief, and let them make the decision themselves.
And again, TJ, I go back to common operating information that allows people from whatever business tribe or security tribe they're in to look at it and say, oh, okay, I see it now.
I'm going to play off of that. I think that common information with one more. But before I do, I just want to say thanks everybody for the questions. Please keep them coming. This has been great so far. So again, feel free to drop those into the Q&A box. But related to the common information subject, or the education, right? Will, several times you've mentioned escalation and how maybe what seems like somewhat of an innocent or maybe not a dangerous threat arrives in week 1, you fast forward to week 52, things may have escalated into bigger or worse. What can we say about that? And, what do folks need to know about how all this fits into escalation and that whole picture?
I think a lot of it, first off, there needs to be, to the common information comment, there needs to be a common nomenclature or a common vernacular that people understand. This is what this means, right? And this is what we need to be on the lookout for. So escalation is if you look at every event that happens, where first responders show up, or you're at the end of it and something bad has happened, there's almost always somebody in the corner going, yeah, I saw this coming. Or, yep, I felt something weird. I felt it was off. Mail in its weird little way is a great little temperature gauge of a situation. The problem is people in the mailroom, facilities, whoever runs it, tends to be left alone and unafraid. And to Chuck's comment earlier about intelligence and how you pull things together, they should be talking and part of the process, because it goes into the HR department as an email. Nobody responds to it. It goes to the company website as a post or a tweet. Nobody responds to it. It shows up as a physical threat now in the mail. What's the next step? You have to tie all those things together to have an effective, defense network set in place. And the information is key about all that. But you've got to be talking the same vernacular to make it worthwhile.
I think that's we have platforms that we can feed data in from threats, and we need to open those platforms up. Many companies might already have an existing platform, and we need to open those up with some training to folks, like in the mail. So if you see something, can you please log it?
Right.
And whether that's a sophisticated platform or that's just a spreadsheet, getting your protective intel folks in to talk to the mail folks, and people are like, why would I do that? Why wouldn't you? I mean, why wouldn't you? Because now you've just augmented that analyst's ability to get potential threat data and say, wait a minute, I'm now connecting the dots. And I think you guys are 100% accurate. Mail is a great bellwether for activity, and especially risk.
Excellent. So that's working our way through the questions here. So last chance, if anybody wants to add any more, please feel free to do that. But before we do, I wanted to add, Will, you have been pulling these statistics. We will make these slides in the video of today's webinar available to everybody who signed up. So we will send that out. But the statistics that you're compiling, your team is also working on an annual report, right, to take this and do some of that analysis that we've talked about. So this could help provide some of that, common information. So do you want to say anything about that report, or, what kind of data are we looking for? And I believe we're coming out early next month. Is that right?
Yeah, the annual one will come out in January. The other thing that we're working on is a portion to our website, and hopefully they'll come out for January as well, where all the data is going to be there. So you can look at the live feed of the last 12 months, 2 years, and track what's going on, where you can see what's in what's around you. If you live in Austin, click Austin on the map, and it'll show you all the events that happen in Austin and who's sending stuff to Chuck's house. I'll give you his address on the side.
See, it's escalating, guys.
Yeah, there we go.
Already. One thing you guys do, and I'll shameless plug you, Will, is you guys put out your regular email. And I have recommended to protectors many times, like if you're in the risk industry, get on top of that. They're also the ROIC out of Jersey. They put something out, and you take those two documents, and we go back to TJ. You're talking about how do you inform folks about risks. I mean, if you're in a small organization and you're not fortunate enough to have a protective intelligence team or an intelligence analyst on, you can start gathering data and points, because folks like Will and the team are out there doing it, and they're trying to make it better for everyone. So I do give you some kudos for doing that, my friend.
Appreciate that. It's free. We send it. So if you want it, my email's here. I'll tell you what makes it easy.
I believe it's on your slide there, right?
Here we go. Emails. So
very good.
If you need something, hit the email. We will answer, and we will send you everything that we've got.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. This has been another excellent webinar. And like I said, the slides and video will be available in the next couple of days. We can send those out. So, Will, Chuck, thank you for your time this afternoon.
Absolutely. We just need to send TJ's address out now.
Yeah, I guess that's only fair.
TJ, and hit Chuck up to his house.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, everybody.